Welcome to the Daring Deeply podcast. My name is David Lee, and this is my wife, Paige. Together, we work with men, women, and couples to help them identify, validate, and heal their emotional wounding through a masculine and feminine energetic lens. Let's jump in. Let's jump into a little bit of why we're here. So this is a brand new podcast, the Daring Deeply podcast. That's the name of our coaching practice, where we help men, women, and couples all over the planet begin to identify their childhood wounding through a masculine and feminine energetic lens to help release them into the relationship of their dreams. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a mouthful. That's an absolute mouthful.
And it's a powerful mission.
It's a powerful mission. So in essence, we help men and women who feel absolutely stuck, not only in life, but their relationship, their marriage partnership. And we help them identify that actually the reason why there's so much complexity and challenge in their marriage relationship is not because they have poor communication, or they need to have more sex, or they have an overbearing, over-conflicting mother-in-law. It's because they have unprocessed, unknown, and unreleased childhood trauma. And actually, each spouse comes into a marriage relationship more often than not with their own set of unprocessed childhood wounding, often called baggage. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, what happens is men and women come together, and childhood trauma is often veiled as powerful, incredible, spicy connection. But in reality, what's going on is the wounded parts of him and the wounded parts of her are actually coming together and recognizing that there's some incredible familiarity that's going on, and that's what's attaching them to one another. And then what happens after months or years is those wounds then begin to resurface in powerful forms of hard conflict and resentment and bitterness. And the reality is those wounds were there long before that they met and long before they became a couple.
Mm-hmm. Often we refer to that as a trauma bond. Mm-hmm. Mm.
Yes.
Most relationships start by trauma bonds, where you and your partner are attracted to each other's wounding.
Yes.
Because it feels familiar, it feels
Exactly.
safe. And so ultimately, the topic that we're bringing forward today is talking about inverted marriage, the inverted marriage dynamic. Mm-hmm. And this often encapsulates many of the trauma bonds that are active in women and in men right now.
I often call it an epidemic. It's absolutely pervasive and it's timeless. And what we mean by the inverted marriage dynamic is that the man in a heterosexual marriage is more in his wounded feminine energy, and the wife is more in her wounded masculine energy. So what does all that mean? Mm-hmm. Energy. Well, the reality is that we all possess, every single one of us on the planet possesses both masculine and feminine energy. We know this is rooted in science. In fact, if we don't have polarity, if we don't have opposite energies, we fall off the planet. The North and South Pole, magnetism, repulsion, attraction. And so within each soul, we possess both masculine and feminine energy. It has nothing to do with gender. And so what often happens because of this unprocessed trauma that begins to overcome an individual and their core energy is now lost. Whereas a man wants to be more in his masculinity and a woman wants to be more in her femininity. But the reality is that trauma has become an overbearing burden, an overbearing force that has forced them to make decisions that lend them away from their core energy.
Mm-hmm. And this is where we get into the inverted marriage, which we have learned that the vast majority of couples are experiencing this exact dynamic. Mm-hmm. So let's explain kind of what might be going on in an inverted marriage dynamic.
Exactly. So let's talk a little bit about what masculine wounding is, or talk about what feminine wounding is, and why are wives more often than not in their wounded masculine energy. Well, wounded masculine energy, as we describe it, is behavioral symptoms such as control, overdominance, a fear of failure attached to achievement, controlling every environment around her. Now, why is she in that energy? It's a protective agency that comes from her not feeling protected when she was a little girl. Mm-hmm. And so she has then developed a wall of protection that's then manifests as wounded masculine energy.
Mm-hmm. It's this overstabilization that she's adapted and experiences now in life because she didn't experience stability growing up in her childhood, from her caregivers, etc.
Yeah, and then on the other side, then we have men who are in their wounded feminine energy, which then entails men who are more appeasing, the nice guy, the soft guy, the guy that gets along. And he's also fearful of conflict and confrontation. He avoids making decisions because he's made decisions, but he's been rejected, either by his wife, certainly, but he was rejected in childhood. Perhaps he did have leadership skills. He was decisive as a little boy, trying to make sovereign and autonomous decisions as a little boy, but those decisions were taken from him. Mm-hmm. He wasn't allowed to make those decisions, that his voice wasn't to be heard. It was dismissed, it was ignored. And so then that develops a passivity where he is now fearful of making decisions, fearful of standing up for himself because he's terrified of the confrontation that could take place.
Mm-hmm. Which is super problematic when it comes to marriage, because if you were to ask the wives of all of those men who are in their wounded feminine energy, all the women, all they want is for him to make decisions, is for him to take the lead and to move the family forward. She doesn't want to be making all of those decisions. She doesn't want to be the leader and planning all the dates and the vacations. She doesn't want to follow up with him about whether he did X, Y, and Z in the laundry list of things. She wants to trust that he's got it, that he is the captain of the family. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, we often talk about in other arenas that there is one phrase that every man wants to hear from his wife, and there's one phrase that every wife wants to hear from her husband. What every husband really, truly, at his ground force wants to hear from his wife is, I believe in you. Mm-hmm. And what every wife wants to hear from her husband is, I've got you.
Yes.
I absolutely have you. It's going to be okay. We're going to be okay. I have a plan. I have a way forward. This is the way we're going to go. Now, that also means that there is opportunities for pivots. But the sexiest thing that a woman can see in a man is that he has purpose, that he has a plan, that he has a plot. And that all comes from healing his wounding from childhood. And the reason why he doesn't have a plan, he doesn't have purpose, because he lacks the confidence that's been stripped away since he was a little boy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And trauma, I want to highlight, doesn't have to be bad. Trauma carries the stigma that it's scary and overwhelming and violating. And while some of it is, trauma can happen in micro moments where perhaps you fell off your bike and skinned your knee and you're in a world of hurt and it was scary perhaps for the very first time. And maybe you didn't have anyone there to help regulate your emotions. Or perhaps someone was there and they told you to shake off your emotions and to not acknowledge them. And so that can be incredibly confusing for young children who are developing. Those are our most formative years. We're building emotional flexibility and resilience in those early years. And so it becomes really confusing for the nervous system and for young little beings to understand, when is it okay to be emotional? When is it okay for me to express myself? Sometimes it's okay, but then other times they just get silenced or sloughed off. And so that can make it super complicated when individuals move out of the house and they're trying to go to college, get degrees, start their own families. And now you have two individuals coming together who've gotten married who have no idea who they are and no idea who they're allowed to be. And so this is where the healing process begins, is we can begin to reflect back on the narratives that have shaped you into what you believe about yourself, who you are in this marriage and who you are with your partner together.
Beautifully said, babe. Yeah, so I want to jump into why we do this. Where did we come from? Why are we now fully immersed and integrated into this work? So it all comes from our own trauma history. It comes from our own pain. And I often say, when people ask me, where did Daring Deeply come from? I will say, well, what I've done is I've turned my pain into purpose. And so because of my unprocessed childhood trauma, it led me into a world to really be introspective, to finally lay down the maverick mantra of that I can do all this on my own. I don't need help, which is incredibly common among men because of unprocessed trauma from their childhood when they were told to get over it, rub some dirt in it, boys don't cry, which are very similar mantras in which I heard when I was a little boy. In fact, you reflected on a moment an example of how trauma enters the nervous system as children. And that actually happened to me. I fell off my bike when I was 5 years old, skinned my knee pretty severely. And my caregiver at the time simply looked at me and said, "You're okay, rub some dirt in it, boys don't cry." Well, what happened in that moment from a clinical standpoint, from a nervous system standpoint, was that entered into my body as trauma. And as we define trauma, it's simply when the nervous system is overwhelmed. So
it has no idea what to do with it.
It has no idea what to do with it. And so that's why we say it's unprocessed. And that's why we can see that one particular traumatic event that happens to a child in childhood doesn't necessarily affect another child in the same way. But what we've also recognized is that trauma exclusively enters the body when we're children. Why? It's when we're most susceptible. It's when we're most vulnerable. And so we carry the echoes of those trauma wounds into adulthood. And then we carry our little trauma bag of baggage into our marriage relationship, and it connects to the wounds of our spouse. And therefore, we will have now a trauma bond. And most often, the inverted marriage dynamic is when he is more in his passive, wounded, feminine energy. She is in her controlling, masculine, wounded energy.
You make a great point, and I want to take it one step further. So what happened to you at 5 when you fell off the bike and you were told that boys don't cry, how did that then affect the relationships that you got into where you were perhaps emotionally unavailable, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great point. So what I heard and what I felt more essentially in that moment was, if you get hurt physically, emotionally, spiritually, sexually, don't show any emotion that's connected to it. And so then I learned very quickly that if I feel, don't show it. And by the way, if you do feel it, if I do feel it, people may abandon you. People may say, you're not good enough. People may say that you're not who you really are and what you feel. And we often hear this in those that we support and help, all of our clients and hundreds of thousands of people across the world that follow us on social media, is that they weren't allowed to be who they wanted and needed to be as children.
Who they've always been.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's super invalidating to the human experience.
Exactly. Exactly. So experiencing the trauma in my life, you experiencing the childhood trauma in your life, led us on a pathway to explore, and you certainly, I'm sure, share your specific story of navigating trauma when you didn't know it was trauma.
Sure.
Yeah. And so throughout my decades of adult life, I would bounce back and forth, trying to identify a way out of the pain that I felt, satiate wounds with ways to circumvent, dismiss, ignore, placate, enable, and say, I'm good, I'm okay, that's not the problem. And it wasn't until I began to identify the fact that I have unprocessed childhood trauma wounding and realizing that now, the fact is, every single one of us on the planet, every single one of us, I'm going to say that one more time, every single one of us possesses unprocessed childhood wounding. Every single one of us. We're all have variances of that recirculating within our nervous system. Walking around, most of us have no idea. It is an unknown entity within our nervous system that we're walking around. The solution, incredibly simple. Not easy, but incredibly simple. And so for me, I began that journey being educated, being trained, gaining the knowledge from incredible foremost progressive minds in the trauma space, the polarity space, the personal development space, to help me learn first, I have this unprocessed wound, many of them. And what that did then transfer into me to say, you know what? I think it's time for me to heal. I want to figure out why I am more in my wounded feminine energy. There it is. And so that began me on the trajectory of my own individual trauma healing. And you have a similar story.
What was it about the inverted marriage dynamic once we really understood what that looked like? Yeah. When was the moment for you that you realized, uh-oh, I think that's us?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So when we met, we connected over many trauma bonds. And I was more in my wounded feminine. You were more in your wounded masculine. And it worked. Well, of course it did. Opposites attract. The law of polarity and attraction will always develop in this way. A man in his wounded feminine energy will always attract a woman in her wounded masculine energy. Opposites attract. And so it happened in our relationship. And it felt normal. It felt familiar because you and I had navigated prior relationships in that dynamic and simply thought it was normal. It was familiar, certainly. But what we discovered was, I think there's something better. I think there's something more. I don't feel right inside of my body when I'm passive, when I'm indecisive, when I carry my emotions without a plan, without a way forward, when I feel like I'm getting along to get along, when I'm avoiding confrontation and conflict. That doesn't feel powerful. That doesn't feel strong within me. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't have healthy feminine energy within me that I need to tap into, but the vast majority of my days, I want to be in my powerful, strong, devoted, protective, provisionary masculine energy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember at the beginning of our relationship when I was experiencing the exact same frustrations and struggles inside our relationship that I had experienced in all of my previous relationships. And I thought, okay, I thought I, completed those relationships so that I could start over and start fresh. But this is the perfect example as to why trauma healing is so important, because it will continue to follow you. Mm-hmm. It will continue to follow you. Mm-hmm. It doesn't just go away. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's this thought that time heals all wounds. And the truth is, trauma just doesn't really go away like that. It actually begins to amplify over time until there is so much emotional leverage to actually shake you awake to say, something's got to change. Mm-hmm. Something has to be different here. Mm-hmm. And that's when you and I were enrolled in a couple trauma programs at that point. We were really learning more about all of this. And I realized, oh my gosh, the common denominator in all of everything that I've experienced is me. So how can I take responsibility for what's mine so that I'm continuing to unload the burdens and the frustrations and the resentment and all of the gross stuff that I was feeling in the relationships, the stuff that felt dissatisfying. And I just feel so grateful that we were on the same journey and learning the same things, because that has made this process much easier for me to feel more at home and whole in my body and in my mind and my heart and my spirit, because I don't have to be so overbearing and over controlling, is because we've done a really great job building safety in our relationship, but also building safety here with myself first and foremost. Yeah. It's been a powerful, powerful journey, and I want that for everyone.
Absolutely.
It's possible. And I think we have shown that to ourselves. And I think that's why we're so passionate about helping couples who are in marriages that feel lackluster. They feel like they're two ships passing in the night. They feel like roommates. There's no connection. There's no playfulness. There's no passion. It's not safe to be themselves because they don't know who they are to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so much of this process in how we help people begin to first identify and validate and make a connection to where that trauma entered their body as a child. That's so much of the process in which, now I made that incredibly simple just now, and it's not easy. It is simple, but that's in essence what we do with our clients, is we help them identify the triggers that are happening now in adulthood and connect them as their behavioral symptoms to unmet needs from their childhood wounding. Mm-hmm. And when they begin to fully grasp this idea, oh, I'm an over-controlling, overstating woman who is exhausted, overwhelmed, and burned out. She's in this overwhelming do energy where she's hyper independent. She feels that she has to do and control everything around her. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, if you peel back the layers, she is exhausted, she is overwhelmed, she is burned out, and may not have any idea why. And the reality is, the truth is, and the answer is, it's because she's in her wounded masculine energy. And there's a reason why I've often said this, that a bored man is a dangerous man. I'm going to say that again. A bored man is a dangerous man, meaning when he's out of purpose or has never discovered his purpose, who he is, what he's supposed to be doing on the planet, what he's been gifted his unique ability, as Dan Sullivan says, when he's out of that alignment, when he's out of his power, of his strength, not his control, not of his machismo, not of his patriarchy, and we'll dispel a lot of that, I'm sure, throughout our podcast live here. It's out of his purpose. And when he begins to discover his purpose, as our mentor Mastin Kipp said many years ago, the opposite of trauma is purpose. And when a man finds his purpose, he can lead himself. And when he can lead himself, he can lead his wife. Not control her, not dominate her, not tell her what to do, but to truly lead because he leads himself first.
Yes, you highlight a great point. There is a vast difference between leadership and control. Control is rooted in this wounded masculine energy. This is the overbearing. This is protection mode. This is overcompensating to ensure that you remain protected and without threat. And then the other side is leadership. And this is where it's rooted in love. It's rooted in life. It's rooted in the best interest of yourself and everyone around you. And this is what we're working towards. This is healthy masculine energy. This is free will. This is choice. This is autonomy. This is decision making, forward action, movement, direction, goals. Like all of that is like juiciness in life. That's what gives us purpose. And it's all so important. And where things get a little sticky in relationships is that line gets really blurry, and it's hard to discern what is healthy and what feels like this actually is harboring pain.
Yeah.
For me, I can recall being in previous relationships where I would be like pestering my partner, like asking them to step up and do this, and I need you to be more of this and less of this. And then whenever they finally would, like they would be super courageous to take action. And then my response would be, well, not like that. That's not what I wanted. That's not what I meant. And so here I am rejecting this gift, their action, them being human, them standing up and trying to provide what it is that I'm asking for. And then I'm just completely destroying them and tearing them apart.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a common story we hear often. And I hear in the men that I coach is I would step forward. I would be decisive. I would take action. I would make decisions, but consistently my decisions are rejected. They're not good enough. In fact, the most common phrase that I hear from men, and certainly what I carried for years, was, I'm never going to be good enough. I'm never going to live up to what you want. Now, what's going on there within both partners is each of them have that unprocessed trauma wounding that they individually need to address, which brings to a point. We have this question happen every day. Well, David, Paige, what happens when one spouse makes a choice to begin the healing process and the other person is not ready to do so, or maybe even be rejecting the idea? The answer to that question is this healing journey, even in the midst of a marriage relationship, is yours and yours alone. So one of the tenets, one of the pillars of our coaching practice is extreme ownership, radical personal responsibility, that you cannot control what your spouse does or does not do. Ever. Haven't you tried? Haven't you tried
It doesn't work.
Your spouse? It doesn't work, ever. You cannot make someone feel, do, believe, or say anything. That is, by the way, a sign of codependency. In fact, when people say, and they will come to me often, almost daily, and say, David, we need you to help save our marriage. We need you to help us fix our relationship. And the reality is, you can't.
And we don't.
And we don't. Exactly. You cannot heal, fix, mend, or save a marriage. It's impossible. In fact, when married people say, hey, we need help to help fix our marriage, that's actually an indication of codependency and a desire to control your spouse. When you say that I want to fix the marriage, you're including your spouse in that, and your spouse may not be on the same pathway. So the answer to the question when someone says, hey, what happens if I want to move forward with you, but my spouse doesn't? Then it's your responsibility to ensure that you're moving forward. And then, of course, the response to that often comes back and says, well, what happens if I continue my healing journey and they don't? Then other hard, difficult, challenging, and yet potentially freeing decisions may need to be made. As we've often said, and we've seen it over the years, haven't we, babe? Mm-hmm. That some of the most important, impactful decisions that an individual will ever make may break their heart, but will heal their soul.
Yes.
And that's really hard to do. We've seen this over the years where we're working with a particular individual and they have moved forward. They have come to a healing space in their life, and they realize that the relationship that they're in presently is no longer serving them. And they have to move to a space of completing that relationship in order for them to move forward, where they can feel like they are truly have the permission and the freedom and the peace to move forward in their healing journey.
And to be themselves and to get what they want and to be in a relationship that feels exactly what they desire. It's connecting, it's playful, it feels comfortable. And those are all the foundational aspects of what the marriage is really supposed to be about.
The question often is, so what happens if I continue to have these triggers that come forward, that I have these emotional dysregulations, that I'm angry and pissed and frustrated and resentful and bitter with my spouse? Well, the reality is that resentment, that bitterness came long before you ever met your spouse. And so what's the answer? What do we begin to do? And again, what we help our clients do is first identify when that trigger is coming forward. Where are you identifying it within your body? We have studied, and we are followers and we are mentees of Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the landmark book, The Body Keeps the Score. We believe that trauma resides exclusively in the body, in our cells, in our tissues, in our bones, and it resides there until we begin the process of beginning to release and process that trauma. And so it comes forward in our coaching practice as behavioral symptoms, being over-controlling, being passive. And oftentimes in our coaching sessions, a client will simply come with a scenario, with a story. Help me understand this. This is what's going on in my marriage. This is what's going on in my partnership. Help me unpack that. And what we do with that is we listen to the behavioral response. What's going on in their life? What happened in that argument? And help them begin to trace it back to that original wound in childhood. It's hard. It's difficult.
Oh, it's so hard. And it's the most empowering, life-enriching work you could ever do for yourself. It's the only work that matters.
Yeah. Folks often say, so do I change my mind? Do I help with affirmations? Do I put little notes all over the house to help me reframe my mindset? And the reality is, mindset work is only a small percentage of what can truly heal your trauma. In fact, from our perspective, often mindset work circumvents our healing. It often says, oh, well, just think better. Just think positive. The sun will come out tomorrow. And the reality is it doesn't. That is a short-term solution. It's very much like putting a Band-Aid on a lethal wound. So we often say yoga, Reiki, ayahuasca, journaling, meditation, taking a walk, getting a pet, going on a vacation. Those will never heal your trauma. They can help prepare your body, your mind, your spirit to begin the process of identifying the original childhood wound. It can help you soften. It can help you bring yourself to a calming energy in order to do the work that we are talking about. But those elements, those don't heal your trauma exclusively.
I cannot even tell you how many years I spent trying to fix myself and my relationships with all of those things.
Yeah.
Every last one of them, and hundreds more, just jumping to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, like, oh, this is the answer. This is what's going to fix my problems with myself and in my relationship. Yeah. And you're exactly right. And I learned that the hard way. I'm pretty sure I overturned every possible rock until it got to this very last one, which was trauma. And that was the last place I wanted to look. I didn't want to dive into my emotional body because at that point I didn't believe I had trauma. It was like, I'm good. I didn't experience anything like that growing up. Yeah. And then when I truly was at the end of my rope, trying to figure out, okay, there is clearly something still wrong that I have not tapped into just yet. It was diving into the unprocessed trauma and understanding how that was impacting not only me behaviorally, how I was choosing to show up in conversation or not show up in conversation, and how I was choosing to communicate, the words I was using. It was influencing my mind, the way I was thinking and overthinking, how I was choosing to believe in myself or believe or not believe in others, just constantly like walking on eggshells and waiting for the other shoe to drop. That's when everything began to click for me, was linking together the unprocessed emotions and experiences from the past and how they were still influencing who I was today, most especially in my partnership. And the way that I've heard emotions get described is that imagine your body is like a tunnel and you're driving through a tunnel in your vehicle, and imagine you're kind of in the middle of this tunnel and then your car dies. And so you're stuck in the middle of this mountain, and the tunnel is your way to get to the other side. The car represents emotions. And the mountain, the tunnel, represents your body. And so what often happens is we'll experience the emotion in the moment, and then the car dies. The emotions get stuck. And it's because we don't choose to feel them and express them into completion. And what we actually want to happen is for the vehicle to make it all the way through to the other side of the mountain, through the end of the tunnel, so that the emotions come to completion and nothing is getting stuck or building up and creating congestion, a traffic jam inside of your body. And so that is how trauma can impact how you choose to show up in your relationship, at work, etc., but also physically too. The body will respond in physical emotions. If you have chronic headaches or constant brain fog or fatigue or fear or migraines or any of those other physical symptoms that are beginning to happen like on a consistent basis, that is an indicator that there is some imbalance happening in the body. And it's really important just to take a step back and choose to lean in to see, okay, what is beneath this? There is something for me to learn. My body is brilliant and it's trying to communicate to you that something is off. And that is our biggest compass that is so overlooked.
Yeah. I'm glad that you brought that up, because I want to accentuate that. I want to bring that forward, is that we fully believe that every somatic symptom, physical, emotional, spiritual, sexual, can all be tied back to unprocessed trauma wounding. We work with men and women who come to us with emotional wounding. They know that. But then they'll bring up in a conversation on a coaching call, oh, and I have migraines, and oh, I struggle with alcohol, and oh, I struggle with this and this, and oh, I have a chronic back pain. Actually, I've been to the rheumatologist so many times that I can't count them anymore. And then what happens is that is a behavioral, physical symptom of an unprocessed wound from childhood, believe it or not. And so we begin the process to identify, tell me when those migraines happen. What's going on in this scenario? And we begin to tie the actions, the responses of what's going on in that person's life in the moment when the migraine comes. And more often than not, we can connect that migraine to a specific moment in childhood when it was being repressed. Something was being repressed, repulsed, shied away, shamed, shirked. I can come up with 42 other S words.
Yeah, the body is truly designed to be resilient, and it is a self-healing machine.
Yeah.
And the biggest work for us is to just get out of the way, to trust that we have everything that we need, and to continue to lean in and offload and delayer and explore and ask questions and release and purge and invite new goodness in. Like, that's what this process is all about, and just to trust that your body's got you. But in order for it to have you, you have to have it. And that's really complicated. There's a lot of stuff that gets in the way of allowing that to be truth for most individuals who walk this planet.
Yeah, you bring up another point where the vast majority of individuals on the planet are completely disconnected and dismembered from their body. And we see this more often than not in women, where they feel completely numb. Yes, that they have been told repeatedly not to feel, not to express, that big girls don't cry. The reality is the feminine woman was crafted and created to express fully all of her emotions all the time.
It's part of her brilliance.
It is part of her brilliance. Well said.
Having access to that emotional range, the spectrum, that's what makes her beautiful.
Yeah.
It brings life. It brings humanity. Yeah. It brings peace and permission.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so often that's been shunned and hid away for so long simply because of these phrases and narratives in how emotions were treated and received growing up.
Yeah.
And so those are the layers that we're peeling back.
Yeah. I want to bring that back to the marriage dynamic, in that it's often stated in cultural, societal, familial circles that women are over-expressive, they're over-emotional, they're high maintenance.
Called crazy.
Called crazy, exactly, for simply being a woman. And as I coach men specifically, it is the man's responsibility in a healthy marriage dynamic to enact what we call his seawall. Seawall, S-E-A-W-A-L-L, seawall, to withstand, to stand up to, and to hold space for every emotion that his wife brings forward. Not to shun her, not to shame her, not to tell her she couldn't feel or shouldn't feel, that her emotions are wrong. Rather, that every single emotion that she brings forward is absolutely correct.
Yes, like that is imperative for her, especially as she is beginning the process of healing those unprocessed wounds, because she's going to be feeling and experiencing a lot for perhaps the very first time, and that can feel very chaotic. And if she doesn't have a partner that is steady and stable and can hold space for her to just simply feel through whatever she's feeling through, then she's going to remain in her masculine energy, completely armored up, walled off, and without the ability or desire to lean into those more tender states.
Yeah. It is a very delicate and fragile and beautiful and powerful nuance that must happen between a man in his healthy masculine and a woman in her healthy feminine. In essence, that's what we're working so hard to help men and women across the planet begin that process, to fully realize from an inversion to an aligned space, much like you and I have navigated. And it's absolutely, unbelievably otherworldly that I get to spend life with a woman who is embodying the very essence of femininity, while I am embodying the very essence of masculinity. And to find and to see and to practice that in real life in our home is absolutely, it's undescribable. And so now we take that, and believe me, we are not perfect. We have our days, we have our weeks where it can be really, really tough, and we are still in trial and error through this process. But we feel like that we have a process. We feel like that we have a way in which we have learned from our own journey to help men and women traverse this really sticky, really hard, really challenging, really emotional journey in which to fully heal.
And really worth it.
Yeah.
Really worth it.
Amen.
It reminded me, as you were sharing, it reminded me of growing up, and even into my early, but up to the point where we got together, I didn't buy tissues. Like, that's how apathetic I was. Like, I did not cry. I did not express emotion. I did not own a tissue box, nor did I buy those. And now we have tissues all over the house. But I just remember thinking, why do people buy those? And it's just because, growing up, tears, just as you mentioned a few of the phrases before, tears were uncomfortable for a lot of people around me growing up. And so it was just kind of sloughed off, and don't cry, or you're being such a girl, you're being overly emotional. This isn't that big of a deal. And so all of that began to tell me that my emotions were not true. Yeah. They were not right. They were not valid. Yeah. And now it's been incredibly empowering to hold space for myself in brand new ways, and to accept and embrace all parts of who I am, especially as I continue to learn more about me every single moment of every single day. Yeah. Yeah. It's hard and so fun. I had so much fun with this.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us on the Daring Deeply podcast. If you're interested, if this has been valuable, you can work with us through a one-on-one coaching environment. Reach out to us through our social media channels, and we look forward to having a conversation with you. Take care, and thank you for watching.